Hello, everyone. I am quite overwhelmed to see so many turn up in person and also knowing that we have got a fairly large number of people joining us online. So thank you for everybody who even turned up online. Um, Makes me feel very proud, but it also does add a little bit to that nervous feeling. I'm delighted to have been invited to talk to you today here at the Norfolk Record Office, which is a place that has unearthed several ephemeral Tudor treats for me and has proven a real treasure trove to me and my research. As a food historian, I research and recreate authentic historic recipes and I bring them to life for the public, like yourselves, to get a good taste of history to speak. And my specific field of research focuses on the Tudor period, so between 1485 and 1603, covering basically the reigns from Henry VII right up to his granddaughter Elizabeth I. I also share findings with larger organizations such as the Historic Royal Palace, as well as a number of food or history podcasts. And in 2021, I also appeared next to Tudor historian Professor Susanna Lipscomb in the TV series Walking Tudor England, where there is a whole episode on Tudor Norfolk. And in 2003, my first book, Eating with the Tudors, was published both here in the UK and in the US. And looking at the turn up here today and online, it is clear that Tudor food is still selling like hotcakes. So today I have the pleasure to take you back some 500 years and show you how people's diet changed in Tudor England from one generation to the next. This is, as you might appreciate, a vast topic. And so today I'm hoping to just get your appetite for more with this sort of whirlwind tour. And any specific questions you might have, we can then answer at the end. As we know, politics, society, fashion, and economy all influence what we eat, how, and when. And today we are taking a closer look at how the Tudors diet was the subject of quite significant changes due to a combination of these factors. In the advent of the Tudor dynasty, the Englishman's diet was very medieval in taste, custom, preparation methods, and food availability. So, in a nutshell, for the affluent, this encompassed mostly white bread, roast or ground up meat, served in thin, spicy sauces, as well as pies, sometimes referred to as coffins. The crust of those coffins served only the purpose of a cooking vessel, way too hard to eat. In fact, it was only their contents that was then spooned out and served onto a plate and served up to the table. The less fortunate had to settle with endless pottages made with cereals and traditional vegetables such as fava beans, cucumbers, leeks, gourds, root vegetables, and cabbages. Bread made from mixed grain, rye together with cheese formed part of their staple, along with chicken and cheap offcuts of meat. It was your rank, wealth, religion, job, age, and even your gender that determined pretty much what food was deemed appropriate and indeed healthy for you. The seasons defined which food was available at any time throughout the year. Preservation methods such as drying, salting, and pickling food could sometimes expand their natural availability. And sugar, as a food preserver, was only really taking off towards the very end of the 16th century. It was indeed the end of the Tudor dynasty that we are beginning to witness a noticeable change in diets across affluent communities, more in line with the onset of what we would classify as early modern attitudes, values, beliefs, and new food introductions. Food that was once regarded as poor man's fare only started to be acceptable food for the upper classes, and hence triggered an increase in certain vegetables, which is evidenced by a growing number of vegetable recipes aimed at the tables of the wealthy throughout the 16th century. Here we've got Big Henry VIII, yeah, good. So early Tudor society presented itself as a social hierarchy in which people knew and accepted their place, or at least for the most part, and therefore Tudor government expected everybody to play their part, and preferably nicely. This system aimed at a general feeling of order and appears to have worked, except for times of famine, when people did obviously rise up against it. This rather rigid system, class system, divided people broadly into four groups: royalty, nobility, gentry, and the peasants. Gentry was the lower end of the nobility, and in the first half of the 16th century, this encompassed anyone with a formal education, such as doctors, lawyers, and gentlemen who had the title knight bestowed on them for special services to the monarch. Peasants included basically everybody else: laborers, tenant farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, and minor clergy. It was the social group of gentlemen that towards the end of the century started to broaden the gentry's entry-level requirements, as William Harrison explains when he specifically pointed out these new arrivals. namely wealthy individuals such as merchants. You see a nice merchant over there. The inclusion of anyone who could make a living without labor into this desirable class of gentry was particularly attractive to merchants who had always been keen to improve their rank. And now, for the first time, money could also facilitate status. And that did not just come with power and influence, but also the entitlement to more food at every meal. Now, here we have, over there, a fascinating legislation document known as sumptuary laws. And as we can see, laid out carefully the precise number of dishes allowed according to the nobility and gentry's specific rank and wealth. And at the top, you've got the king, and then it works itself down. It's not very easy to read, but I've taken out the most important part for us here, where it says that wealthy members of the middling class could now join the club of social peers who were officially allowed up to 3 dishes per meal, as long as they had an annual income of £40 or more. An entitlement they would happily flaunt, as evidenced by several dinner books from a number of London. And because we do have people joining us from America today, I have included the dollars because it's easier to understand what that means. So we have £500 there, and we've got the £40 here. However, entertaining nobility over a feast was ripe with an array of expectations and pitfalls. This paragraph at the very bottom here advises that if the guest was of a higher standing than the host, the dish allowance went up according to your guest's rank. Imagine having to ask your dinner guests for their annual income in order to work out what was an appropriate menu to set. And while Tudor government tried to avoid food waste, that was their excuse for telling people how many dishes they were allowed to have with each meal. Regulating how much food you could eat under the careful guidance of sumptuary laws, physicians had your best health at heart. And here we have there's Andrew Borde. Andrew Borde was probably one of the most famous physicians in early Tudor England, and he wrote this regiment or dietary called Dietary of Health. And what did he have to say? It might come as a little surprise that in Tudor England, your class also determined what food was considered healthy for you according to your profession and your level of physical exercise. Sounds very modern, doesn't it? Labouring people were advised to eat gross food. And in Tudor talk, this means hard and hard to digest and filling food, and not as we would understand it today. Bacon, beef, fava beans, cabbage, leek, parsnips, salsify, cheese, and whole meat bread were a good example for such a rustic, gross food. And peasants, which refers to all the working class people in Tudor England, would have had just one dish per meal. And this was generally a vegetable-based pottage with grains and bacon or beef and brown bread with cheese. And we see some examples there. Here you see a selection of food that I have prepared. And for the dainty stomachs of the rich or students, the nobility, however, required more delicate, fine food, and easy to digest was required. And dietary, or also referred to as regiments, as we said earlier, recommended mostly roasted meat served in heavily spiced sauces for the upper class. Sugar, regarded as the Tudor equivalent to superfood, was expensive and classified as a spice. It was often sprinkled just over almost everything, whether savory or sweet didn't matter, just for good measure. Then you have got your spice selling merchant. At court, there was even a dedicated spicery where these sauces were prepared. Spices served two purposes. For one, being expensive, they added the desired image of wealth. But more importantly, they were believed to aid in preserving not the food, but your body. Spices were indeed used by the Tudors as an anti-aging agent. Spices, it is, keeps us healthy and looking young. Only a few vegetables were deemed safe for the nobility at the start of the Tudor reign. Those that were, not surprising, were relatively hard to obtain and hence expensive. Examples are asparagus, globe artichoke, newly introduced cultivated carrots, turnips, and spinach. New fashions during Elizabeth's time, however, started to introduce a much wider range of new vegetables to the diet of the nobility and the affluent, as we will see later. During the Tudor reign, not only changed the palette of available food, but also what physicians considered a healthy, balanced diet. Whilst in the early days, only cooked vegetables and fruit were deemed safe to eat, towards the end, there is an indication to some fruit and vegetables being enjoyed in their raw state, but not without a word of warning by Thomas Muffet, another Elizabethan physician, commenting about the consumption of raw strawberries. There, strawberries eaten raw, and I just love this example he gives. Be careful, because the Duke of Brunswick, who was recorded to have burst asunder, you know what I think everybody has a good imagination where that happened. Right, now, balancing a diet in Tudor England. So, the Tudors' medical understanding of what a balanced diet was based on a concept established by Galen in ancient Rome. So, ancient science, ancient medical advice. It was believed that the human body was made of body fluids, known as the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile. And these had to be balanced in a healthy body. Now, every human, according to the Tudors, was born with a certain predominance of these, which could change with age, physical exercise, illness, or simply being exposed to a different climate. During Henry VIII's reign, physicians would generally advise the patient to stick to food that shared the same characteristics as their own humoral makeup in order to preserve one's good health. So, in a nutshell, that meant that you eat food according to your status and as set out by Tudor physicians, such as Andrew Bord, who we met earlier. Only in time of sickness would you then need to change your diet according to your symptoms. But that changed. As the medical body still does today, they keep changing their opinion, what's good for us and what's not. So, in Tudor England, physicians changed their stance according to the latest state of knowledge by the time Elizabeth came to the throne. And now the key to a balanced diet was to choose corrective food, which humoral characteristics opposing your own. So basically, just change everything around and you'll be fine. Now, and if you think that sounds all very confusing, you would be absolutely correct. Balancing your humours was a science in itself, and this perfectly explains why dietaries guiding you through this mess were one of the best-selling genres in the Tudor world. By the turn of the 16th century, authors of Tudor regiments also found it increasingly more difficult to ascribe humours to new, unfamiliar foods from the New World, which would eventually contribute towards the system of humours being phased out completely about 100 years later. High time, too, I think. Now, what did religion have to do with what you ate? So most of us probably will be familiar that in Catholic Tudor England, the church also had a big say in what you eat and when. Rome gave strict instructions and orders to abstain from meat during Lent, on Fridays, Saturdays, as well as during the time before Christmas, known as Advent. In its place, the consumption of fish was encouraged in order to demonstrate personal redemption. Now, why fish, you might ask? It might sound a kind of comical to us today, but fish were considered free from the sin of sex because they don't copulate, and hence were a suitable alternative to the sinful consumption of meat. The Reformation, however, dumped compulsory fish eating as being too popish and introduced a new culinary fashion to the upper class: sausages. So, once considered the food of the poor only, sausages started a new posh popularity, enforced by Protestant leaders who deliberately ate sausages on Ash Wednesday, so to openly defy Catholic Lenten rules. And here we have a nice recipe for making sausages from the Good Housewife's Treasury. This also explains why recipes for sausages only start to appear after the Reformation in recipes, which were written always for the wealthy and never for the poor. And like today, the state of the economy also had an impact of what Tudors ate or what was available to purchase. In Elizabethan England, after the Reformation, Catholic values were replaced with Protestant views. Eating was still dominated by several food restrictions. But now, these were not imposed by the church, but now by economic sanctions. And after a short respite under Edward VI, the compulsive fish eating on certain days a week was back on the menu to deal with an acute shortage of meat, triggered by the steadily growing middling class who now felt entitled to put daily meat on their table. Under Elizabeth's reign, England was also very slow in following other European nations in the quest for exploring uncharted territory for economic reasons. But this new European business venture also witnessed some unfamiliar, exotic foodstuff from the New World, as well as the Far East, arriving here on English shores. While turkey, kidney beans, and pumpkins, as well as sweet potatoes, were embraced without hesitation, it would take several hundred years for the English to welcome potatoes, tomatoes, or maize into their kitchens, despite these being readily available and consumed on the continent. It was the cash-rich merchants that were the main driving force behind expensive food imports, such as oranges, spices, and dried fruit, especially in the first half of the 16th century, and later newly available exotic imports from the Americas. In Tudor England, food was also used as a social marker, which signaled power, status, and wealth to the guests and the wider community by means of excessive, pricey ingredients and rare foods. At the beginning of the Tudor era, if you were so inclined, you would flash your cash by offering your guests dishes loaded with high status meat, such as venison, or very expensive imported spices like saffron, cinnamon, ginger, mace, and cloves, as well as dried fruit, oranges, and lemon. By the close of the century, you had to up your game and offer at least foreign cheese from France, Italy, or Holland, Turkey, or sugar-loaded, luxurious, finger-licking banqueting sweetmeats, as you can see here. When it came to new food fashions to adopt, the English faithfully looked at their European neighbors for trends to copy. The use of butter as a spread on bread was pretty much a totally alien concept to the English, which they had observed from the Flemish immigrant community in the second half of the 16th century. Here in Norfolk, we know them as the strangers. Butter in itself was not very common in England, as a Flemish immigrant in Norfolk bemoaned in a letter to his wife, 1567, when he asked her to send him butter making equipment, because according to him, it was, for here it is all pig's fat. So obviously he wanted some butter on his bread. The influences of Tudor England, that's the nobility and people with money, were also responsible for new food fads. There is, for example, the Elizabethan craze for eating salads, which in their infancy were just boiled vegetables tossed in some kind of dressing, but later evolved into proper raw salad leaves as we know them. The arrival of sugar from Morocco and later the New World, but in the 16th century, the New World sugar did not arrive in England, one of the big misconceptions, made the biggest impact on the affluent and Tudors culinary experience. This opportunity to tap into the market of greater quantities of imported sugar in the late 16th century triggered the most celebrated Tudor culinary trend of so-called subtleties and sweetmeats. And here you see subtleties. These are all made from sugar paste, and courtesy of my talented daughter. So you have playing cards here, you have a chess set there. The availability of more affordable sugar enabled at least the rich to preserve fruit as marmalades and preserves, as we have just seen. But this development went hand in hand with a new form of edible crust, pastry crust, which replaced the medieval flour and hot water coffin cooking vessel which we met previously. This fine, sometimes referred as royal pastry, was made from flour, butter, eggs, and water, and was intended for consumption now. And the earliest recipes for such butter paste started to appear around the mid-century, and you have one recipe there. The one single ingredient that introduced a unique juxtaposition of culinary delight and horrendous physical suffering to the affluent class, but sparing the fortunate poorer in society, was definitely sugar. Praised and celebrated by the court, sugar was found all the way into cookery books, despite some early doubts, judging by the foreign accounts about the Queen's black teeth. Now, this is a little gem here from the Tudor Norfolk Record Office, which I found. I'll show you in a minute what it reads. So sugar also conveniently helped to sweeten influential people, like the extended arms of the law. And just down the road in Wyndham, John Simmons, a junior collector of rents, recorded 7 shillings paid for 2 gallons of wine and 1 pound of sugar for his Lord Judge in 1588 or 1589. And you can see, oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Right, yeah, it says item paid for gallons of wine, and I paid for sugar for the from the side it's hard to sugar for my Lord Judge. There's the Lord Judge. Oh, it starts here, so that's why I couldn't find it. But it's lovely to see that they used sugar to bribe the local judge. Try that today and see how it works. So this must have been pretty much out of the ordinary, as the scribe somehow, pointing the finger, felt the need to draw attention to this entry. So sugar clearly made the perfect bribe. Not Tudor, modern. So, concluding, we can concur that the Tudors were really not so different from us when it comes to our desire to eat what we want and our willingness to experience new exotic flavors, along with falling for new foodie trends. Dubai chocolate comes to my mind here. We can also admit to having a sweet tooth and to boasting to others about the food we eat. My selfie, my supper. And as a society, we are still guided by nutritionists and dietitians on what to eat to remain healthy and fit. Sadly, we are also still limited to food we can afford. If we compare the food that we enjoy today with that of our parents or even grandparents, it also becomes clear just how quickly diets do change. There is, however, that one significant difference between the Tudors and us. In Tudor England, it was the people at the bottom of society who enjoyed a truly healthy and balanced diet, which was based mostly on fresh seasonal produce. That order has sadly been reversed lately.